BA Blocks, brought to you by learn.ba.
Amit asks, in the companies following agile practices, at which place the role of business analyst fits better? Should BA be part of the Scrum team, or should the BA be out of the Scrum team and working with the product managers on identifying product logs and prioritizing user stories? And again, this is a perfect example of how Agile runs and how you can manage your backlog, which is what we're using here. But the response that I gave in our community here was that, just read out my response. I said, Amit, it's a great question. Generally speaking, the BA should be tightly integrated into the Scrum team to make sure that the developers don't have any requirements or specification related backlogs and related blocks. Sorry. Now, I also said that this answer assumes that much of the pre-work related to business requirements has already been completed with the product owners and managers, and that the BA is strictly producing and refining the detailed functional specifications at this point. Now, if this is not the case, then the answer becomes a little bit more complicated. And so that's what I want to talk about. I want to elaborate on that a little bit more here, because I want to explain to you what it is that I meant by that. So typically, the way that every project runs is that there's a phase of the project where you define the scope and you define what the client needs are. And then there is another phase of the project where the analysis work, or the analyst, is concerned very strictly with detailing out what all of those different needs and features are going to be like. And so whether you're running a waterfall project or an agile project does not change that fact. And so some of the misconceptions that are out there about agile projects is that you don't need to do the upfront work, which is not true. So whether you're on an agile project or whether you are on a waterfall project, the upfront work of defining the scope of the product or the system that you're delivering needs to be done. And so what I've said here in my response is that, assuming that you've done all of that upfront work to define what the business need is, the analyst should be very tightly bound to the team that is delivering and building the product or the solution. Now, if that is not true, then the situation gets a little bit more complicated, because what you're doing at that point is now you're starting to define the business need at the same time as you're detailing out the specifications, detailing out the solution. And there are many projects that run that way. It can be a lot more stressful as an analyst to do that. And that's also a lot more stressful for a lot of the architects and the developers, because the way that software normally gets constructed is that there is a certain amount of architecture work that has to be done before a single line of code has been written. And unless you know what the solution, the scope of the solution is, the developers can't do their architecture work properly upfront, which means that what tends to happen is that the coding that they do and the components that they build are done without the proper architecture, which makes that part of their process much, much more difficult. And so in an ideal situation, the way you would run a project is that you would define the business need and the scope of the project up front. You would let the system architects, software architects, do the work of architecting, building out a blueprint for the system that they are going to be delivering. And then once they do that, what you do is you start to detail out the functional specifications and handing them over to the developer so they can do the build, knowing that they've already done a big part of their architecture work up front. Now, on many agile projects, especially if organizations are running agile, where they don't necessarily really understand how software is constructed at a detailed level, they tend to skip that architecture phase of the technical architecture phase. And that is part of what creates a lot of the stress in a lot of agile projects. So going back to Amit's question here, so like I said, the answer, the way that I answered this is I said, the answer assumes that much of the pre-work related to business requirements has already been done. Now, if that assumption does not hold, what happens is that you, as an analyst, you can't be tightly bound strictly to the Scrum team, because a lot of your time and attention now is being spent with the business to try to elicit the business needs, at the same time as you're working with the Scrum team to try to define the functional specifications that they're supposed to build to, right? If the assumption holds, you've already done all of that business work, work with the client and with the business upfront, and now you can be very tightly bound with the Scrum team to make sure that they don't have any blockages. But again, if that assumption does not hold, your attention is now split between doing the requirements work and doing the specification work all at once. And that makes your life a lot more difficult, and it makes a lot of the developers and architects' life a lot more stressful. And so it is very important for agile projects to make sure that they understand that there's a certain amount of requirements work and a certain amount of system architecture work that happens before you even open up your backlog or before you kick into different sprints. So that is the more comprehensive answer to understanding that. And I hope that it has answered the question fully. If it has not, and you have follow-up question, feel free to find Amit's post by doing a search in our community, and you can add your follow-up questions there, and we'll take those questions, we'll add them to the backlog, and we'll address them as they come in. So in terms of the items I wanted to cover in this live session, I have covered everything that I wanted to.
BA Blocks, the building blocks for your BA career.